Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 1:30 panel on 5G networks and smart cities. I will be your moderator, Jason Nelson. I am here representing the Smart Cities Council. We are an organization dedicated to helping cities accelerate through their smart city pre-procurement planning process so they can get organized and prepared and ready to utilize technology to make the world a more livable, workable, and sustainable place. I'm joined today by three very accomplished gentlemen. I will let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how their organization plays into 5G and smart cities. Jim, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Jim Lockwood, CEO of Aero Wireless Group. We work with the wireless industry and municipalities and energy companies to focus on how we can communicate and expedite the densification process of broadband, particularly 5G networks.
I'm Rob Pegoraro. I'm a freelance technology journalist, which means I try to sort of understand and make sense of all this. Confession, I don't quite understand all of 5G, so maybe this panel will educate me. And I'm also a taxpayer, so I guess I've got that stake in smart cities progress as well.
That's good.
That is good.
Josh?
My name is Joshua Ness. I'm with Verizon 5G Labs. Our job is quite literally to predict the future. 5G is a technology or a connectivity platform that is going to enable advancements and entirely new technologies, much in the same way that 4G did. And my team's job is to work with external ecosystem innovators as well as with our internal teams to figure out what some of those technology use cases are, how to build out the initial MVPs, and then go from there.
Outstanding. So let's just jump into, in your role working at Verizon's 5G lab, you hear a lot about the different technologies that are coming down the road. What are some applications that are going to drive 5G network adoption, and why should cities really care about that?
Yeah, I think you're starting to see some of it already. I mean, you're with the connected kiosks, and everyone knows that we have some of the smart cities applications out there on the streets right now. But I think the real advancements in smart cities that are going to require 5G, they're going to come from things like using computer vision to do some of the data gathering, the data processing, edge compute to manage that data, and then what I think is going to be really interesting is the integration of the personal device and technology ecosystem collaborating in tandem with the cities themselves. So that it's not just the smart city showing me information about the city. It's the city applications behaving and reacting to the activity of the people and the cars and the other types of technologies in its ecosystem. And I think it all is going to be this interconnected thing. And I think you're going to require, or we as cities, we're going to require 5G connectivity and the all various currencies or capabilities thereof, of which broad bandwidth is only one, in order to make all of that function properly.
So let's break that down for a second. So one of the big in a lot of the big marketing tools that we see from Verizon and others, we see you can download a movie in 6 seconds, right? Right? I mean, that's how it's being marketed. It's going to be so fast.
Who downloaded a movie to your phone in the past 30 days? Anybody? When? Why?
We got one.
Because you were flying? Because you were taking a trip?
Literally, it was on an airplane and there was no seatback video, so I had no other choice.
It's the only time anyone does that. But who remembers LimeWire back in the day?
Yes.
Yeah. Napster? Yep, this guy. Yeah, because you know how long that took, and you pulled your hair. See, I ain't got no hair back here because I used to download a bunch of videos. Man, that's how we can wrap our heads around 5G. Like, oh, you can download a movie like that. Great, but that's like, how does that help anybody? How does that help smart cities? How does that help the development of new technologies and getting developers, like people like you, to start thinking about how 5G is going to impact your future? In my opinion, it doesn't. There's better ways to think about it, and I'm really happy that we're up here talking about it.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about that. I mean, one of the things you mentioned was it'll help with the multitude of devices that are coming onto the network. I mean, again, we could poll the audience and talk about, who's been in a crowded, busy environment and had, a very poor network reception, even though you were there yesterday and were able to download perfectly fine. And it's just because the network was congested, the backhaul was congested.
Yep.
That's also another way way that that network will be enhanced by 5G.
Exactly, and that is one of the other capabilities of 5G is accommodating up to 1 million connected devices per square kilometer. So if you've ever been to like a sports stadium, had tried to download your e-tickets, and all of a sudden the app stops working because, like you said, the backhaul gets congested, it solves that problem. But it also enables new ideas, the ability for fans in a stadium the size of something like, I don't know, Citi Field if you're a Mets fan, to be able to use AR applications to get real-time information about what's happening on the field. And that is just one example that we can think of. The issue is that there's dozens or hundreds more than we haven't thought of yet.
So one of the applications that I've seen in a smart city context especially was that, if you want to move your mic a little closer, there you go, was that I was taking a tour of the Chula Vista Police Department a couple weeks back, and they are a municipality that is landlocked without access to an airfield. So anytime that there was a high-speed chase or a need for a helicopter response, they had to call around to one of their neighbors and try and borrow a helicopter. Right now, what they've done using existing 4G technology is create a drone program that will go up about 100 meters or so, and then be able to zoom in with a camera and respond to calls. So it creates an opportunity where the city is able to save a significant amount of time and money by responding to calls that may or may not be necessary. One of the examples that we heard was that there was a call from a 7-Eleven of an unruly person standing in front of the store threatening patrons. What they did was they popped the drone up. They were able to zoom in and see, okay, they called the 7-Eleven back and said, hey, we're looking at your store right now. The disturbance seems to have moved on. Is there any need for us to respond? And they looked outside and they go, oh, yeah, you're right. No, we don't have to. So it's just an example of being able to save citizens time and police officers time and money in order to be able to respond to more important needs.
I really thought that story was going to end with the drone tasing the suspect.
Thankfully not yet. We're not there yet. But that's, so I mean, a 5G application of that technology would allow, a significantly higher resolution camera, significantly more range, and the ability to be able to, really respond much more quickly.
Yeah, this speaks to force readiness and first responders technology. Yeah, absolutely. Having first responders know what they're going into before they go into it is a massive application in and of itself, that it can also speak to smart cities and can work within that ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those are some really good applications. Do you gentlemen want to add anything to that discussion about the
one question
applications?
I want to wrap my head around here, and I'm sort of speaking as the consumer advocate here. How much of this in a smart cities context, where we're not talking about lots of data, we're not talking about really low latency needs, how much of it could be done with 4G instead, where you don't need to build an entirely new infrastructure? And in the case of millimeter wave 5G, you've got to have a cell site every few hundred feet.
Yeah. I think that's a question of how we think about how smart cities applications now, and IoT applications in general, how we think about them now versus how we start thinking about them in the future. Now it's sensors, right? It's temperature, it's humidity, it's velocity, it's things like that. Fairly easy to where you can have, like Verizon, for instance, rolled out a narrowband IoT network dedicated just for this. It operates at 800 kilohertz. It's super easy, super low maintenance, but it's dedicated for IoT applications. But now, once you release those capabilities, the question there is, will IoT applications change? Will smart cities applications change? Will they start relying more on edge compute to enable things like intelligent video, enhanced drones, and a bunch of capabilities that, like I said, we can think of, a bunch that we can think of now, but some that we can't think of because people like you and everyone else here hasn't necessarily thought of them yet, but we will.
So those are two different things. So let's talk a little bit about, and I think you opened it up to how is the network going to change, right? Well, how is that going to change, going to impact the city, impact citizens, impact the operators themselves? Jim, you work for Aero Wireless. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you see that happening?
Yeah, I just want to point out one thing. This is a slide behind me which needs to be recognized, is that there's when we look at the 5G implementation, it's one thing when you're looking at stadiums, private venues where the stakeholders want to see this happen, the audience, the customers want to see it happen. But when you're dealing with municipalities, the proposition of having a pole every 200 feet throughout the city, thousands of poles, is kind of the first impression of a municipality. And so, there's a lot of ways to make this work. So it's not this concern for pole pollution. And one thing that has to be kept in mind, which I'm showing here, is that the structure itself is permanent. The structure itself that might house a small cell technology, might house a sensor, and really bring this to life and tie right into the fiber networks. It needs to be recognized as part of the community from that point forward. And so often it'll be changing out an existing light pole rather than putting in a new pole. Or it might be putting in something very attractive that is going to be fairly frequent throughout the city. In New York City, you have Link NYC. You see it fairly frequently. It's something that had to be designed to be ubiquitous and visually good. The other point on here is that the equipment itself, the wireless equipment, the radios, they're going to change out probably at least once a year, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So these structures have to be future-proof. IoT technologies might change out constantly, and they might be added to. So one thing that has to be taken into account is just future-proofing this infrastructure so that sidewalks and roads and construction crews aren't out there replacing poles and putting in new infrastructure, and the ones that are there blend in and fit in well with the environment. Just a couple more slides here. This is an example.
Good representation, yeah.
Yeah, this is an example of just blending in what do you need to take into consideration. The structure on the right, there's about 350 of these throughout Denver, Colorado. Very well received by City Council, by the community. That came about through really collaboration with City Council members, community groups, and the wireless carriers, recognizing the community has a lot to say about this, independent of some regulations that are out there. And so that ended up being something that it's really proliferated, and it's been well received. The other example, the one here in the middle, this is that's a photo rendering. Unlike the one on the right, that's an actual photograph. The one in the center it's a traffic signal in Manhattan, and we developed this solution for the city. It's under consideration right now, where as you go by a traffic signal, nothing really looks different. It's replacing one that's there with one that has a lot more technology in it. So if anything, the base of this one has a little more beef to it, but it's still the same slenderness as what the bottom of that pole looked like.
So you're saying we don't need to crowd up the city streets with pole after pole after pole
Absolutely
after pole?
not.
It's not going
That
to be
is
like
not
the
a realistic fear.
No,
the cell tower tree you see along like the Jersey Turnpike or whatever.
Right.
And that's often a big concern. And the one here on the right, to my right, is that's Boston in the financial district. There's a real concern about basically having a negative impact on the existing environment. So the idea was, what kind of technology, what kind of radios, what kind of architectural details for a minimal additional cost can be done to have this fit into the environment.
So one of the things that these types of solutions will enable, and that we talked a little bit about, is an extra resiliency through the network, right? Because it will have embedded within it what will be included within it?
There's where we're heading and things we're working on right now. It's actually it's deployable now. It's early stage. Is basically backup battery storage. So if we're looking at a critical network, let's say the drones that Jason's talking about, where it's tied into the police department, or you're talking about an area that often has power outages during spikes of power. It's important to have embedded, and it's possible to have embedded into these poles, quite often into the foundation of the pole, lithium battery cells, so that if the whole power network goes out, you can maintain up to maybe 40 hours, depends on what's being dependent on that site. If it's a smart street light, we've now been able to achieve having up to 40 street lights in that area maintained by one underground battery cell. So as we look at these critical IoT technologies and even just wireless, an extreme example would be what happened in Puerto Rico, where they've had just not to say that a lot of these little underground cells could have covered all of Puerto Rico, but there could be certainly regions and hot spots where the public can congregate and know that they have cell coverage and they're able to get a call out through a network, or at least have power.
And we had talked a little bit about the additional edge network computing that will be enabled by the 5G network. That will also have, there will be space in these enclosures for additional sort of edge computing and low latency network operation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that'll be a combination of hardware at those cell sites themselves with those radios, but then also and in addition to that, it'll be in those areas where we call them nodes, where a lot of the radio backhaul comes together, and you see them out on the streets right now. They're these big green utility boxes in some cases, and we can start putting and equipping those nodes or those central access points with servers and CPUs and GPUs to start handling a lot of that load that otherwise would be offloaded to the cloud, which has some latency ramifications, or handled on device, which then has hardware ramifications on the end user. So I think it'll be a combination thereof. Keeping in mind, this has not been deployed yet, but it will be over the course of the next couple of years.
So talk a little bit about what that, well, I guess, Jim, maybe, you want to talk a little bit here about just the visible differences that'll happen here as part of that.
Yeah. So, left unregulated or unencumbered, what you see on the right are the types of things that we want to avoid, and that everyone wants to avoid, including the carriers. And that's kind of what's happened in some areas where it just kind of got out of control, and things are added over and over. So what needs to happen is, and is happening today in most urban areas, is what's on my right. And that is, you can see the equipment, the radio equipment. It's embedded inside of a pole structure. If it's a power pack, it might be embedded underground in a vault. But this is basically a concealed structure. And there might be some things on the outside that have to be on the outside. That could be traffic counters, environmental sensors, things that you want on the outside of the pole. But as far as the guts, the cabling, the equipment, all of that can be managed on the inside of a structure.
What I love about this picture here on the right is it's very clearly a public safety camera and two Department of Transportation cameras of some sort that have all been sort of bolted onto the same pole. That is what we at the Smart City Council are finding is happening all over, is that a lot of these various siloed departments are not communicating with each other. They're capturing duplicative data. They're doing things that are just completely independent of each other. And one of the hopes that we have is that cities are starting now, and we're seeing this all around the country and frankly around the world, that cities are now embracing these smart city infrastructure as a package, as a citywide entity, and looking at it combined with their local utilities, with their local universities, with all the various departments from public safety to public works to transportation to health and human services, and coming together to embrace the technology. One of the things that we talked a little bit about, and you just brought up, was that the network is going to change with having all of that additional computing power and that high volume of bandwidth. It's going to create a lot of new hardware opportunities as well. Because the technology is going to be available where maybe instead of having a $1,000 phone in your pocket, you could have a $50 phone or a $50 device, if you will.
Yeah, and I'd actually like to hear Rob's thoughts on this as well, from that taxpayer thinking about it critically from that point of view. In not only consumer devices, but also that'll impact IoT and smart cities as well. The idea being that in 2007, when the iPhone was first released, everything happened on the device itself. Cloud computing wasn't really a thing yet, especially for consumers. Now we're to the point where a lot of the activity that you have on your device is offloaded to the cloud, which frees up a lot of processing power on your device, but the device still needs to have a lot of that power to enable a lot of the other applications that your phone is doing. And then if you were to offload those to the edge, where you can keep all of those processes relatively local, it has implications and ramifications for what the device itself, what the end user device itself can be, because it doesn't have to have that big powerful processor, and therefore it doesn't have to have quite a big battery. If you think about it, this phone has looked like this for 12 years. We haven't had a UI evolution in 12 years. That's crazy.
Apple got rid of the headphone jack.
Well, yeah, exactly. We're getting there, which leads to peripherals, right? As a society, now we're using AirPods, where we used to have our phone up to here. We're using Apple Watches that are connected to the network. Pretty soon, we're talking about a whole connected ecosystem of personal devices that communicate with the network, much the same way that these connected cities will. And the cost and the form factor of this hardware will go down over time.
Now here, since we have that nice image of all these cameras mounted on a pole, we have to talk privacy. If you're going to have sensors in every block, how much data are you collecting? How much of it do you then get rid of? How do you practice data minimization? And I'm interested in hearing about things, for instance, if you can push more of the computing out to the edge, Google and Apple have both been talking a lot more about moving stuff back to the device. So you don't need to upload all your information to the cloud. Your phone does a first pass at it and uploads only the stuff Google or Apple actually needs to provide the service.
Right.
So on the one hand, I guess this is more a question to every city deploying a smart city infrastructure. What are you going to do to protect privacy? Because that's been an issue in Toronto. Google has this Sidewalk Labs project to rebuild a whole neighborhood, and they hired a very good privacy advisor for that, Ann Kavukian, who resigned in protest because she was convinced they were not doing enough to anonymize their data. And I think, speaking as a journalist and a taxpayer, this has got to be part of the discussion on the front end. Can we build in privacy? Because I'm pretty sure one thing 5G won't change, even though everyone says it's going to change everything, data breaches will still happen.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we see at the Smart Cities Council is that, cities... privacy for the citizens absolutely has to be a concern, and where I think there is extra concern on the Google project is around one company owning everything, right? The whole soup to nuts, every part of the equation. Where there are cities that are moving forward with smart city projects where a lot of times the city is the keeper of important data. One example I have is from the city of Detroit, where they had Health and Human Services had data on expectant mothers from disadvantaged communities that were having trouble getting to prenatal appointments. And so they were the keepers of that data, right? They were able to manage and keep that data secret and secure, but yet they worked with private companies like Lyft to be able to provide free to the mothers rides to their prenatal appointments. Mm-hmm. And the city was paying for those rides in exchange for a very great, aggregated, greatly reduced rate, because it meant for lower overall health costs that they would have to pay in the end. Yep. That's a great opportunity of cities and public and private partnerships coming together, solving problems in their community, and keeping the data separate, anonymized, private. Right. I can see, there will definitely be concerns if it was one single company that was owning everything soup to nuts. But when you have my biggest concern with city and data and privacy is really around how do we get these things out of servers and out of pockets within the community that nobody else knows exists, right? You've got you're trying to put together an opioid data map of where police are responding and using Narcan, on folks that need it. And yet, Health and Human Services is keeping exactly the same data, and they're not talking to each other, right? They're not helping each other out. They're not identifying areas of opportunity and using that data in a way that makes sense and furthers and betters the community. Yeah. So I don't know if you had anything to add on the privacy question.
I think from a city perspective, it's a matter of centralizing a lot of that decision making. And you talked about these different, in this photo here, these different agencies having some of the same equipment, gathering the same data, but not sharing it and not using and not enabling that interoperability. And there's a lot of cities recently that have appointed CTOs and CIOs to centralize a lot of that decision making, to say this is where this data collection is going to be happening, and this is how it's going to get dispersed and shared, and this is how it's going to be kept private. Someone who can make those decisions in real time. I think cities are going to have to evolve in the way that they handle technology as the technology evolves as well.
Yeah. So we, at the Smart City Council, we're actually working with the Commonwealth of Virginia, with their Chief Data Officer, on trying to put together a project, because we asked him how, he's trying to identify areas of opportunity where they can, he can help advance the interests and help these projects move forward in all of the 120 plus communities that he has to represent. And the problem is he doesn't know what all of these communities are doing.
Right.
So it's hard to get that information up. So we've actually developed some tools to help them uncover that opportunity and find ways that they can help with mentoring and really move that forward. So one thing you mentioned real quick was the change of network is going to create the opportunity for new devices. Talk a little bit more about that, especially for this crowd. I think that's something that they would be very interested in.
Oh, yeah. I think as you think about the way that we, from a personal consumer perspective, the way that we consume information from our devices is visual and audio and tactile, and you're able to deconstruct those, and if all of those things can be connected to the network and showing you the information and giving it to you in certain the formats that you want it, whether that's delivering music to you through AirPods and AirBuds that are connected to the network versus glasses that are AR glasses that look like Warby Parkers that are able to give you an AR experience. Now you take that into the industrial side, and robots that required cables to go into walls both for power and data. Now the form factor of those things can change immensely, and they can move around and can be retooled and reformatted. And then bringing that back into smart cities, you can have plug and play cameras. They don't need to look like that. They can be much cheaper. I think the way that the network will continue to evolve with compute evolution will change the device requirements, and therefore will democratize a lot of these things and make it easier and cheaper for cities to adopt them, and hopefully therefore spur decision making and make it easier. What do you think?
Democratizing technology is always good. As ever, the one thing, my biggest worry with 5G is uneven deployment, given that it has these requirements for millimeter wave 5G. As a refresher, 5G, there isn't just one flavor of it. You've got the millimeter wave kind, which is the one you hear about. It has the lowest latency, the fastest speeds, and the worst range.
Right.
And then you've got mid-band 5G, which is, you wouldn't deploy that here,
right,
but you might have to. You go too far upstate or into New
Yep.
Jersey. There is actually a part of the Garden State, I can assure you, and that's where you're going to have mid-band 5G.
Suburban environments, yeah.
And so, there's, if we get into a situation where we can have smart cities, but we can't have smart towns, which has broader issues. As a consumer-focused journalist, one thing I'm really attuned to is 5G going to get us affordable residential broadband. So we have an alternative to, the phone company,
right,
or the cable company. And I know you all are selling residential broadband in your initial markets like Sacramento and Houston.
Yep.
And if I had $1 for every time a reader had said, is there any other choice besides, say, Comcast?
Yep. I think 5G does come in a lot of flavors. We've, as Verizon, we've debuted two of them. One is that in-home broadband fixed wireless access that Rob was alluding to, where we take that millimeter wave and we beam it into a window, and it hits a receiver, which then powers a router and creates a Wi-Fi cloud. So any Wi-Fi enabled device can then connect via 802.11 to that 5G core and realize a lot of those benefits. Then you talked about the mid-band sub-6, below 6 gigahertz, much greater coverage, but you lose some of those latency and bandwidth advantages over millimeter wave, but you're still talking much more significant than 4G. You're still talking about being able, and I think what we'll see is that you'll still be able to power a lot of this this second and third generation smart cities deployments using that mid-band. I think that'll be okay. And then you start thinking about what people talk about, how 5G does not work indoors. And when you couple that fixed wireless access with advancements in Wi-Fi technology, 802.11ax, sometimes called Wi-Fi 6.
Wi-Fi 6 is such a better brand name than
it really is,
802.11.
I think it opens up a lot of doors, and I think the way that we think about connectivity continues to change, much in the same way that it has changed. How, 2 years ago, if someone said your watch is going to connect to the same network that your cell phone does, would you have believed them? No, you wouldn't have, because it's the way that we start thinking about the adoption and the enablement of these technologies will not stop. And so just because right now we're 5G doesn't work indoors. There's no reason to have it. Well, I mean, it doesn't work indoors the way that you think it should work indoors, but that doesn't mean it's not going to.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about some of the, I mean, if you think about some of the conversations you had at E3 this past week, the ways that it could change music streaming and gaming and engagement of all of the different content. We were just saying backstage about how, you've got the ear pods. You might not need those to connect to a phone in the future.
Right.
It might be able just to stream your Spotify, and you just control it with voice commands. And all of a sudden now you don't even need to be carrying a phone anymore. Yeah. I mean, there's hundreds of applications like that could be coming in the future as long as you start thinking of it differently.
Yeah, as you're able to move compute around in software-defined ways, I think the implications for personal use as well as for smart cities applications really just opens up, and we're going to be reliant on groups like the Smart Cities Council, as well as cities and municipalities themselves, to start thinking about technology with an open mind about how this connected layer can be used to enable a whole lot of different value-added services.
So how does that work? I mean, you get into a situation where every block or so you've got your 5G cell site. It's got its own edge compute capability. Is the city then letting other vendors run stuff off that, or is the carrier doing that? Is that something that gets negotiated each time?
I wish I had detailed information about that, about the deployments and the contracts. I don't, unfortunately. I think those are definitely options.
I know when you all built out your network in Sacramento, California, part of the deal was there was the first market where 5G was lit up. You all were going to build a variety of smart city applications for the city to do things, I guess, like better time traffic lights.
Yep. Contributing to Vision Zero, things like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the carriers, we have to be good partners with the cities and towns that we go into, and I think we're creating arrangements, some of which might be plug and play, some of which might be custom, to where we are being good partners in the collection processing of data. I think will be crucial moving forward. I think you'll see that a lot.
And again, I mean, I've seen a lot of first responder applications already start to emerge where, you're able to create, put data at the fingertips of those first responders. As they're going into the burning building, they can have the schematics and know where things are. And so they're not running into, a dead end.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that, switching topics here, I want to talk a little bit about is, what are some of the obstacles to 5G deployment? I mean, why do we not have 5G today? We've been talking about it for some time. On the network side, Jim, I know that there's a lot of sort of obstacles with, getting the network build out and helping make that happen. We touched on a little bit of it here.
Yeah, I think one of the obstacles on the municipal level is it's training, it's education, it's bringing the decision makers of a municipality together. And letting them know what the purpose is and what are the benefits downstream. Ultimately, the carriers are trying to serve their customers, which have cell phones, and they want to have this access to 5G, higher speeds, different technologies. And at the same time, there's business communities in cities that want to benefit from that as well. Often municipalities look at it from the standpoint of, if there's going to be all this new infrastructure, it's going to use a lot of my resources that we don't have. Tearing up streets, sidewalks, putting in fiber, that's that initial perception. And there's a certain reality to that in some cities, particularly older cities. So I think there's a lot of the unanticipated slowdown and roadblocks in getting 5G deployed has been municipalities really getting their head around why is this so important, and how do we participate in this? How can we contribute and be a part of the network, or the part of the team that's making it happen. And I think there are some things that have happened in the past number of years where so many municipalities just couldn't get past that barrier, that the FCC, state Senate bills have kind of come in and put some regulations in place to help push and nudge that along. And that's been very helpful, but on the other hand, it's also left kind of a tone of suspicion, a little
Perception
bit.
gap.
Perception gap, yeah.
It's definitely true that building out telecom infrastructure has been made more difficult than it has to be by various things. In some cases, incumbents have said, oh, you want to get access to our utility pole to add your transmitter? Well, that'll be $1,000, and we'll tell you when in the middle of the night you can do it. And just passing, so one policy goal that's been talked about for years is just have a dig once policy. If you're going to open the streets, if you're going to put up utility poles, make sure you add conduit space to add broadband later on. And that was first put forth, I think, 2007, a Representative Ann Issue of California. It finally was signed into law last year. So it got to be dig once, talk forever. But we did finally get that done. So it's just, 12-year timetable to...
But I mean, the cities have a real role to play in, contributing to their adoption and moving forward or not, right? I mean, they have, in many cases, they have access to, the conduit and the rights of way. They have the aesthetic concerns that need to be addressed. But they also have fiber in the ground in some cities. They have, the ability to help really move this forward. One of the concerns that I think you raised was the digital divide. Right now there is that digital divide between some of the extremely rural communities in America. 5G has the potential to exacerbate that if cities don't get on board and create that foundational layer of infrastructure that will enable economic development. I mean, do you see that as a concern as you...
Not so much with 5G, but in general, I mean, basic stuff. So just today, the chair of the Federal Communications Commission acknowledged what people have been saying for a while, which is that the broadband availability data the government collects is terrible. ISPs just have to say, do you sell broadband to anybody in this census block, which could be just an actual city block or it could be much further. And the result is this really vague data that suggests many more Americans have broadband access than actually do. Microsoft started looking at this and they said, well, we know how fast people connect because we know how long it takes them to download or Windows updates. And so they found, for instance, one county in eastern Washington, the broadband map suggested something like 90% of the people there had at least 25 megs down or whatever the standard they were looking at. And they found it was more in the below 5%, maybe none. And they found gaps like that all over the place.
Wow.
So if you don't even know who doesn't have broadband, if the data you have suggests that, oh, it's great, we have all this choice and competition, well, we don't, then it's going to be really hard to decide where the problem is and how do we fix it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we see that it's so important that cities do get out in front of this and start to adopt it because, it has the power. And one of the things that I think we've talked about previously is that it has the power to really help bridge that digital divide in disadvantaged urban areas especially, right? Some cities need to get on board because they have some communities that are very far behind in their service offerings. And if you work with your local providers and your local operators and you can come up with ways that they can make sure that those communities don't get left behind.
Yeah, we've been working with our foundation, the Verizon Foundation, to do exactly that. At the 5G Labs office, one of the things we do, like I said, is work with external developers to develop new technologies built on 5G because I'm an expert in 5G, but I'm not an expert in education technology. So we went out to education technology providers and creators and we said, hey, if you had 5G, what would you make? And we gave them equity-free funding, we gave them access to engineering resources, we gave them access to active live 5G in our lab here in New York City on 24th Street. And they, over the course of 6 months, created entirely new ed tech products that use VR and AR to teach concepts of robotics and cell structure and space formations. And now we're taking some of those same products and we're rolling them out into disadvantaged schools in Cleveland, Ohio, and other schools in that region because they are in that urban area, we're able to light them up with 5G fairly easily and using some of that fixed wireless access we talked about and now deploy some of these ed tech products into these disadvantaged schools so that these children can start learning in fundamentally different new ways.
Oh, that's great. That's really
good. And we do this across sectors as well. One of the reasons I was excited to come and be on this panel with you guys is because we're doing that right now. We have a general built on 5G challenge where we're looking for the next great product or service or suite of products or services that will actually use 5G to solve problems in new ways. We're offering $1 million to a company that can come up with a really great idea, and we'll then go and co-develop it together and then go and see how that can be used for the public good. If you want more information about that, come talk to me afterwards. Also, Verizon5glabs.com is a place you can learn more information about that.
So that's a good transition to kind of our final question, which is, happy to leave it open for questions if there's any in the audience. We'll come back to that in about 5-10 minutes. But wanted just to ask, so what are some things that the consumer electronics community here needs to do in order to prepare for a 5G future? What are some of the things that they should be thinking about? I'm going to come back to you in the end. Jim, why don't we start down here?
Okay. Yeah, I think coming up with smaller form factors, coming up with technologies, whether it's sensors or cameras, keeping in mind that we want to avoid this kind of a situation, and also trying to design around basically a technology agnostic kind of a network. And I think what's really important is to just have things that are very attractive if they're going to be on the outside, and very, very reliable. It's very expensive for a municipality to go up on top of a pole and try to replace some equipment because it went down.
That's good. And there'll be a lot of industrial applications too, right? I mean, it's not just cities, but 5G will enable a whole host of different devices that'll be coming into, as you said, universities and factories and everything else.
I know John Deere is embracing 5G and this technology very, 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 very aggressively, just to try to differentiate themselves and be able to do a lot of automation with in the farming industry.
That's great.
So my advice to the electronics industry would be dial back the 5G hype just a little bit. Because you've got companies that, I was at the Mobile World Congress trade show in Barcelona in February.
Well, there's your first mistake. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with going to Barcelona.
I love that show, but yes, there is a lot of 5G hype.
You have phones getting rushed to the market where they only support millimeter wave 5G, so no one should buy a 5G phone right now. Sorry if that kills your sales. But because the ones you're buying right now don't support the mid-band 5G, so they're going to be really limited. You have our friends at AT&T decided they would advertise a 4G upgrade as 5G evolution. There ain't no such thing. That's not 5G. And suggesting that people have 5G when they don't is a problem. Suggesting that it's going to, and regulators do this too. I've got a whole folder full of crazy quotes from FCC chairs, trade group presidents, people in Congress about 5G will change everything. No, it won't. It will solve some problems. It will make some things better, but
So then what is a realistic time frame in your estimation? When should we? We need to start preparing today, though, for that future of 5G. But when do you think that'll start to achieve critical mass?
So the way I'd put it this way, I'm in the market for a new smartphone, and 5G is not on my shopping list. 2 years from now, but I have no problem about buying a phone that doesn't have 5G, in part because I don't want to spend $1,000 on a phone. Actually, that would be too cheap for any 5G phones built right now.
Yeah.
So, different if 5G is going to be what brings broadband to your house and gives you a third option for residential connectivity. That can't come soon enough. But as far as should this influence your buying decisions as a smartphone shopper, I'd say relax. It's okay.
Yeah. But Jim, you're seeing whole communities starting to be built on 5G.
We're seeing. There's communities. Lake Nona would be an epic example of that in South Florida, outside of Orlando. Last week we were participating in the build out that's still going on right now in Tampa, Water Street, Tampa, and these are communities that are largely backed by some investors or companies that are saying let's build out a whole community, tie it into the hospitals, the buildings, the residents, and see if we can't meet the demands of really oftentimes the generation that's coming up, or the technology companies that want to be there. And these are, they're finding, we're hearing numbers of 25 to 30% increases in real estate rates in those communities for those people that want to live there.
So the economic development is real for those communities that embrace 5G. Yeah, and I think it's important from our standpoint. 5G is just a means to an end, and for every city, it's different. Some cities really care about providing that economic development push that their community needs to attract the next factory or the next community development that's going to lead to meaningful growth for them. Others care about connecting up their community colleges and helping to train the next round of engineers and folks that are going to help grow their community. Others care about aging seniors, letting them be able to age in place, having the ability for them to get diagnostics and connectivity to to their doctors from their homes. So it really depends, what is going to be the key driver for the community. But I think that the power, regardless of which community you're in, is there, and it's definitely something that communities need to start to embrace today, rather than wait. Yes, the technology isn't quite there, but we need to start moving until it does. And I'll let Josh, if you want to talk a little bit about your challenge coming up, and how do you see the future?
Yeah, as far as advice to developers, time the bow on that last one, is understand that 5G is more than just throughput. 5G is more than just faster internet. It has a lot of other capabilities that you're going to be able to realize benefit and value from, and be able to create benefit and value for your customers. The ability to support a massive number of connections in a short period of time. I think the Mermaid Parade is next weekend. Anybody going to that? Anybody been to the Mermaid Parade? Love it. It's
Y'all
great.
should.
Yeah. Do you know what happens when you get down there? Your phone stops working. The Mermaid Parade? Oh, it's on Coney Island. It's amazing. Come talk to me afterwards.
It involves mermaids, for real.
Yeah. The ability for a phone to have a handoff between cell sites moving at 500 kilometers an hour. Now you think to yourself, why would I ever need that right now? My phone to have a successful handoff between cell sites at 500 kilometers an hour? The answer is, spoiler, you don't. But there are applications that are up and coming where you might. And it's up to people like you and people like everyone else back in that expo hall to start thinking critically about, how does this impact the evolution of technology? It's not just faster internet. It is so much more than that. So take a look at, we've dubbed them the 8 currencies of 5G. It's marketing speak. There's 8 benefits that we've identified that will assist in the technology development. Now, that leads to the next point, which is, I was at E3 and people are talking about my games work fine. Why would I need 5G in the first place? My answer was this. We had 3 developers there who had built some of the first ever 5G mobile games that look like Steam, something you might play on a desktop that actually function on a mobile device because of 5G. Now, they were the only 3 developers at that conference, and it's going on right now. They're the only 3 in that entire conference who can make that claim. And this is the last year that will be true, because other developers in the next 12 months are going to get on board and start developing new ideas. And they might be crude at times. They might only be taking advantage of 1 or 2 of these benefits, but they're going to start developing this and they're going to need to, because the customers, regardless of whether or not you take Rob's advice, are going to be purchasing some of these devices and be having some of these experiences.
No one ever takes my advice. That's my problem.
And if technology providers are not building for the future, they're going to get left behind, much the same way that cities who do not start thinking forward about the adoption of new technology in smart and safe ways are also going to get left behind. And the ramifications could be lost revenue, lost tax revenue. There's a lot of implications there, and I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us to start thinking critically about how technology should evolve quickly, because 5G is coming like a freight train. We've been talking a lot about deployments. Yeah. I don't know if you know what a 5G radio looks like, but if you go outside in New York City, this city is already wired for 5G. It's already here. The networks haven't turned it on yet, but those radios, those nodes are out there. I can point them out to you. And so, it's coming. And so if you don't start developing on it now, somebody else will. So if you want to be some of the first to develop on it, please come talk to me afterward.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts from anybody here?
So I will say the one thing I hope 5G will make a difference for me is, every year I go to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, if this will actually get my phone a reliable signal, that could certainly get me an upgrade.
Yeah?
I'm in for that. Second that one. All right. Questions from the audience? Let's go with Janice over here. So with that, I believe we have to wrap up for the afternoon. Yeah. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for attending, and join me in saying...